Hello there. Good evening, everyone, and welcome back to the Galactic Archives. If you're new here, my name is Meshla. Oh my goodness. I'm a writer and archivist of a long-running Star Wars fanfiction project that I like to call the Galactic Archive. The Archives began as a place to gather stories that grew out of a single character, Marin Durza, but over time it became something much larger. It's a space for exploring how stories hold memory, how characters carry each other through difficult moments, and how quiet strength often shapes a narrative just as much as the big heroic moments do. In these stories, you'll see Jedi, Marines, Mandalorians, and ordinary people standing beside one another, not because they're perfect, but because they choose to keep showing up for the people around them. A lot of what I write about is resilience, what it looks like to endure, to recover, and to keep moving forward even after the difficult chapters. The reason I call this space the Galactic Archives is because stories deserve to be kept with care. Every scene, every character, every small moment of courage becomes part of a larger story. Tonight's stream is just one small entry in that record. Sometimes we read chapters from the stories themselves. Sometimes we talk about the craft of writing and how stories are built. And sometimes we just explore Star Wars lore together or spend time in the Star Wars The Old Republic. No matter what we're doing on stream, the goal is always the same: to provide a calm place to explore stories together. This community is intentionally a quiet corner of the internet. You're always welcome to chat, but you're just as welcome to listen quietly, work on your own writing, or simply enjoy the atmosphere. So whether you're here for storytelling, world building, Star Wars lore, or just a peaceful place to spend an evening, welcome. I was attempting to use something and it wasn't working. Give me just a minute while I sort that out. Oh dear. There, yeah. Okay. I am still sorting things out with everything that's been going on with my computer. So I am glad that you guys are here. So please bear with me as I deal with some minor technical issues that I'm still sorting out. Let's see. All right. Here we go. Hey, Ajo, thank you for that lurk. Tonight's workshop carries us into a slightly different layer of storytelling, one that often becomes visible only after the readers have fallen deeply into an ensemble story. We're calling this workshop Support Characters as an Emotional Infrastructure. Our case study tonight draws from Steps into the Past, chapters 14 and 15, with scenes set in the relative calm after immediate crisis, where recovery and tension coexist in the same quiet space. These two chapters give us an especially strong example of something many writers feel intuitively, but often struggle to articulate. Sometimes the emotional weight of the story is not carried by the protagonist alone. Sometimes it is distributed carefully among the people that surround them. And when this is done well, those surrounding characters become infrastructure rather than noise. We'll be looking closely at 4 particular people tonight. Ethan, the grounded strategist who absorbs uncertainty so others don't have to carry it. Jared, the constant emotional tether, offering presence without pressure. Greer, structure, perimeter, and reliability embodied. And Callista, yielding as permission rather than command. Together, these four form an ecosystem around Marin, and none of them exist to steal narrative attention. Instead, they each support a different emotional load. The distinction is important because when writers try to build ensemble casts, one of two problems often appears. Either your support characters disappear into functional roles, becoming flat tools, or they become so emotionally active that they start competing with the protagonist for narrative focus. And that's not what we're trying to do here. Chapters 14 and 15 show a quieter path between the two extremes. Take a second to take a drink of water. When we talk about support characters as emotional infrastructure, we're talking about how stories create stability through relational systems. Infrastructure is something you notice most when it's missing. A bridge rarely draws attention to itself when it works, but without it, movement stops. In these chapters, emotional movement happens because multiple characters absorb different kinds of pressure. For example, in chapter 14, Greer watches without crowding Marin. His silence creates space for Marin to attempt movement again without still feeling protected or like he's being overbearing. Jared offers closeness and steadiness through proximity rather than instruction, allowing emotional vulnerability without forcing Marin to talk about what happened. Ethan frames her recovery as mission-level legitimacy, turning emotional uncertainty into structured choice rather than weakness. And Callista's care physically grounds the scenes, reminding both character and the reader that healing is ongoing, not a narrative interruption. Take a moment to notice what's happening beneath the surface of the story. No one is demanding emotional revelations. No one is delivering dramatic speeches. The emotional system functions quietly, like architecture. This is what keeps ensemble-heavy scenes from collapsing into chaos. Each supporting character occupies a specific emotional lane: reassurance, protection, accountability, nurturing, and also vigilance. The protagonist doesn't lose the central focus. She gains survivable space around her instead. Let's give it a little context. Scaffolding versus spotlight stealing, which is what you might actually be thinking about. Let's talk about some craft language here. A scaffolding character supports the emotional arc of our protagonist. They reinforce the theme through behavior, and they create opportunities for emotional movement without demanding narrative focus of the story or the scene itself. A spotlight-stealing character resolves emotional beats for the protagonist, explains feelings the narrative should have let emerge naturally, or introduces competing emotional stakes that overwhelm the central arc. What makes chapters 14 and 15 instructive is how carefully the supporting cast avoids pulling focus from Marin, even while remaining fully active. Take, for instance, this specific moment in chapter 14. Greer doesn't offer a speech or even reassurance, only presence and a small acknowledgement as Marin laces her boots and chooses to move again. This is scaffolding. The emotional moment belongs to Marin, but Greer's presence validates it without overt commentary. Similarly, Jared's support often appears as not acting, such as allowing space, waiting before he touches her, and offering calm rather than solutions. In terms of craft, restraint actually becomes an active storytelling decision, and that restraint actually can help build trust with your readers. Readers then begin to understand these characters know her limits. They adjust themselves around her instead of demanding she adopt instantly. That adjustment is emotional infrastructure in motion. Understanding multi-character emotional systems unlocks several advanced techniques as a writer. One, you can maintain tension without constant conflict. And having said that, most of my stories do involve conflict. When support characters carry emotional strain differently, scenes remain dynamic even in quiet settings. Two, you prevent emotional overload. Instead of forcing one character to experience every emotional beat directly, the weight is distributed across their relationships. And three, you develop relationships through behavior rather than exposition. The reader sees who each character becomes under pressure. And four, you control pacing through emotional delegation. A protagonist can pause, recover, or even process while other characters sustain narrative motion. This is especially important in long-form storytelling like I tend to do, where emotional realism demands recovery, hesitation, and non-linear progress. As we move forward into our primary case study for this evening, keep three quiet questions in mind. Who absorbs tension instead of expressing it? How do supporting characters adjust themselves before their protagonist changes? And where does care appear as structure rather than dialogue? These three questions will help us track emotional systems instead of individual moments. Thanks for the lurk, the sniper. And Ajo. Here's a question to carry with you as we continue. There's no need to answer aloud unless you really want to. In your own stories, or ones you have read, who quietly carries the emotional weight so your protagonist doesn't have to hold everything alone? Just notice what comes to mind. Thanks for the shout out, Wraith. As we enter into our case study, we're going to slow down and stay very close to the emotional mechanics of both chapters 14 and 15. Rather than treating these chapters as plot advancement, we'll treat them as a living system, a network of people holding different kinds of weight at different times. The external stakes are present, danger exists, threads are moving beneath the surface. But the emotional question these chapters ask is quieter. How does a protagonist continue moving when the emotional burden would realistically be too heavy for one person to carry alone? The answer is ensemble infrastructure. Each supporting character absorbs a specific strain so that Marin's emotional arc can continue without collapse, and importantly, without losing the trust of the reader. Let's walk through this carefully. 1. Ethan, strategic emotional containment. Ethan's role in these chapters is subtle because he rarely speaks at length. His influence appears more through framing. When he speaks with Marin, he doesn't attempt to erase fear or simplify her uncertainty. Instead, he converts emotion into structure, something survivable. In chapter 14, when questions arise about readiness and timing, Ethan reframes her recovery as operational reality rather than a personal failure. Trying counts, he tells her, validating her effort without demanding results. Craft-wise, this does something important. It removes pressure from the protagonist without reducing the stakes. It stabilizes the tone of the scene, and it signals to readers that progress is allowed to be incremental. It doesn't have to happen all at once. Actually, I prefer it that way. Notice what he doesn't do. He doesn't make a big grand speech about hope. He doesn't take over the emotional moment. And he doesn't just solve the problem. Instead, he absorbs the anxiety and redistributes it into manageable language. Later, in chapter 15, Ethan's silent exchanges with Greer reveal another layer. He carries strategic worries so Marion doesn't have to process it fully in the moment. The concern still exists, but it sits between the supporting characters first. This is scaffolding through emotional containment. As writers and as readers, we can observe a key principle. Support characters can hold knowledge without consuming narrative focus. The protagonist remains central because the emotional consequences still land, but the preparation happens elsewhere. Is there a character in your story who helps translate chaos into structure for others without becoming the emotional center themselves? That's definitely something to think about. Two, Jared, proximity as emotional language. Jared's role is defined almost entirely by restraint. He rarely directs, he rarely insists. Instead, he stays close enough to matter while leaving agency intact. In chapter 14, his support appears through physical positioning, such as sitting nearby, matching her pace, offering contact without expectation. In chapter 15, this pattern continues. A hand placed gently over Marin's, not to interrupt, but to ground. The craft lesson here is significant. Presence can carry more emotional meaning than dialogue. Jared functions as an emotional tether. He doesn't ask Marin to explain herself. He doesn't push her toward any particular realization. He simply makes it safer for the emotion to exist. From an ensemble perspective, this prevents emotional overload. If Ethan carries the strategic strain and Greer carries vigilance, Jared carries intimacy and steadiness. Notice how these lanes do not overlap excessively. That separation keeps each character distinct while reinforcing the same central arc. For us as writers, this becomes a question of choreography. Who stands close to your protagonist? Who speaks? And who waits? These decisions can communicate relationship dynamics more powerfully than explicit emotional statements. Where in your writing might silence or proximity communicate support more effectively than actual dialogue? I do a lot of that. I do a lot of just kind of existing in a scene because I don't feel like having the characters talk all the time really gets anywhere. Three, Greer, stability as emotional infrastructure. Greer is perhaps the clearest example of scaffolding. His consistency is the point. He watches, he assesses, and he often holds the perimeter. In chapter 14, his reactions are minimal. A simple nod, a shift in stance, space made without commentary. In chapter 15, we see him handling operational concerns away from Marin. Veil reports, watch rotations, quiet strategic vigilance. What this creates is emotional stability through predictability. Readers will understand that Greer will notice things. Greer remains steady, and his presence means things are being handled, and he doesn't even talk about it. This allows Marin's vulnerability to exist safely without constant narrative reassurance. There's no advanced craft principle here. There's an advanced craft principle here. A stable character can carry emotional continuity by not changing dramatically. His steadiness becomes contrast. Because Greer doesn't shift wildly, even subtle softening, a quiet look towards Marin's room, a silent signal, it lands with greater emotional weight. Writers sometimes worry that consistent characters can feel static, but stability is not stagnation if meaning evolves around the character. Greer doesn't change rapidly. The context around him shifts, and that's often enough. And before anybody asks, yes, I'm stretching. We have an ad starting in just under 5 minutes, my friends. Do you have a character whose consistency helps your reader feel safe enough to notice other characters changing around them? Four, Callista, healing as permission. Callista introduces a different kind of support, nurturing that doesn't remove the protagonist's agency. Her scenes in chapter 15 are practical and grounded. She's checking injuries, applying salve, and acknowledging progress without declaring completion. The phrase "better doesn't mean healed" is especially instructive. It prevents emotional simplification. In craft terms, Callista functions as a pacing mechanism. She slows scenes down physically with touch, her routines, and embodied details. These actions pull the narrative back into the body, which is vital after traumatic or high-stakes sequences. Without this grounding element, scenes risk becoming purely psychological or strategic. Sorry. Seems Frosty is back in town. I don't know if that's a good thing or not. Another key observation: Callista doesn't override Marin's emotional process. She offers permission to rest rather than demanding compliance. That distinction preserves the protagonist's agency, which is a critical line between scaffolding and control. And here's something for you to think about. How might an act of care in your own story reinforce agency rather than replace it or take it away? Yeah, Frosty was not here for a little while. 5. Ensemble balancing. The emotional system in motion. Let's zoom out slightly from everything that we've been talking about. Across these 2 chapters, you might begin to notice a pattern. Ethan absorbs uncertainty and strategy. Jared absorbs immediacy and emotional grounding. Greer absorbs vigilance and safety structure. And Callista absorbs physical and emotional permission to heal. Because the emotional responsibilities are distributed, no single support character overwhelms the narrative. This is an ensemble balance in action. If Ethan also provided emotional intimacy, or if Jared handled strategy, the roles would blur, and scenes would feel a little crowded. Instead, each character becomes part of a system, and importantly, Marin remains the emotional center. The support system exists because of her arc, not alongside it. This is the difference between ensemble storytelling and emotional competition. Ooh. 6. Micro movements and time perception. One of the quiet strengths of chapters 14 and 15 is the pacing. Time feels slower. Recovery is measured not in dramatic victories, but in micro movements. Marin lacing her boots, sitting through a conversation, allowing others to touch her, and staying present in a room. Support characters influence this pacing by how quickly they react, or don't. No one rushes Marin forward. This teaches the reader how to read the scene. Watch for small progress, trust in quiet movement. As writers, this is an invaluable technique. When support characters slow their own urgency, the reader slows down too. And in slower pacing, emotional nuance becomes visible. Where in your current draft could slowing reactions, rather than adding more dialogue, reveal deeper emotional movement? I'm going to pause there because we're about to have an ad. I will see you guys back in a minute and a half. Okay? Go get a drink of water. And we are back from our ad break. Thanks for hanging out, my friends. I appreciate you. I hope you actually had a chance to get a drink of water. It's important. All right. It's important to stay hydrated, which is what I am trying to do right here. Also, I have been attempting to wear appropriate shirts. As some of you might know, most of my shirts, actually all of my shirts that I wear on stream, are from Into the AM. This is by no means a sponsored stream, but I really like their apparel. Really nice stuff. And they have some cool space-themed shirts. 7. What these two chapters quietly refuse to do. Perhaps the most important lesson that these chapters refuse to do is resolve emotions. The support characters do not fix Baron's pain. They instead make space for it. This preserves the tension while allowing connection, a balance many stories often struggle to maintain. Readers feel safe, but not complacent. That balance comes from our infrastructure. Care exists, danger exists, healing is ongoing, and nothing is final. And that incompleteness is what keeps emotional momentum alive. We've now looked closely at how chapters 14 and 15 build an emotional system through differentiated support roles, restraint-based characterization, behavioral scaffolding, and ensemble balancing that protects protagonist's centrality. Next, we'll widen our lens a bit. In part 3, we'll focus on secondary examples, and we'll compare how these same techniques appear elsewhere across the arc, and explore how emotional infrastructure changes as story pressure rises. As you sit with this section, consider quietly, which of your supporting characters currently carries emotional infrastructure, and which might still be competing for the spotlight without needing to. Part 3. Secondary examples and comparative craft discussion. Why we're stepping back here. After spending some time very close to chapters 14 and 15, it helps to widen our perspective. Emotional infrastructure isn't something that appears only in one chapter. It's a structural choice that echoes across the entire arc. When writers build strong ensemble systems, readers often don't consciously notice. What they feel is stability, a sense that characters continue existing even when the narrative focus shifts away from them. So in this section, we're going to compare patterns across the broader arc and look at how support roles evolve without losing their emotional function. The goal isn't plot comparison, it's to see how emotional scaffolding adapts as circumstances change. One, recovery versus tension phases. Infrastructure under different pressure. In chapters 14 and 15, the emotional environment is relatively contained. The estate, the hearthroom, the war room, all spaces designed to hold stillness. Because the environment is stable, support characters often operate quietly. Greer watches and measures, Ethan frames his decisions calmly, Gerald remains close without pushing, and Callista slows the scene through care. But if we look at higher pressure sections elsewhere in the arc, the same characters don't abandon these roles. They translate them. Hello, Lord. Welcome in. It's good to see you. For example, strategic calm becomes decisive command under fire, physical proximity becomes tactical protection, and observation becomes active perimeter enforcement. The lesson here, infrastructure shifts expression, not purpose. A support character should feel recognizably themselves across emotional climates. If their entire function changes with the plot, the continuity breaks. Think of this as an emotional architecture adapting to weather. See where that takes you. If your story moved from quiet recovery into high tension tomorrow, how would your support characters translate their emotional roles rather than replacing them? Sorry, shoulders cranky. 2. The evolution of watchfulness, repetition with meaning. A repeated behavior across these chapters is watchfulness. Jared watches from close proximity, Greer watches from structure, and Ethan watches from a strategic point of view. This repetition could become redundant, but it doesn't, because the meaning evolves. In Chapter 14, watchfulness communicates concern and recovery awareness. In Chapter 15, watchfulness carries suspicion and emerging threat awareness. It's the same behavior with a different emotional context. This is an advanced ensemble technique. Repeat behaviors while shifting emotional purpose. The readers subconsciously register this as continuity while feeling progression. If every emotional beat required an entirely new gesture, stories would begin to feel unstable. Instead, recurring behaviors become emotional anchors. Is there a small repeated behavior in your story that could evolve in meaning as the circumstances change? 3. Shared silent communication as ensemble glue. Another pattern worth examining here is silent exchanges between our support characters. Ethan and Greer often share unspoken understanding. Jared and Greer communicate with minimal signals while Marin rests. These moments serve two purposes. They deepen side character relationships without shifting focus away from our protagonist, and they show a functioning system already in place, a history that existed before the scene began. Thank you for that lurk, Daz. Welcome in. I hope you're well this evening. This matters because ensemble stories become believable when relationships exist independently of our protagonist. I know. That's okay. I'm glad you're here. Oh, it's just I'm not drinking enough water. That's all it is. Yeah. I'm just not drinking enough water. I did have a bit of a cold though. Getting over it. However, notice the restraint. These exchanges are brief. They reinforce the tension but do not create competing emotional arcs. Oh no. I hope she feels better. Yeah, there's some nasty stomach virus and all kinds of stuff going around, so definitely take care of her. Make sure she gets lots of rest. These exchanges are brief. They reinforce tension but do not create competing emotional arcs. This is the difference between infrastructure and subplot dominance. The reader understands. These people coordinate to support the central emotional journey. Do your supporting characters feel like they know each other outside of the protagonist's perspective? Vocabulary is important. You're gonna redeem vocabulary, aren't you? Yes, I had a feeling you would. Let me go find one for you. Oh, goodness. Nope, here. Daily vocabulary. See, do I have something that we haven't? Oh, sorry. Let's Let's see what's in here. Let's see. No, you're fine. I just gotta find a word that we haven't talked about before. Oh, here we go. Here we go. This is one I don't think that I have done before. It's not necessarily related to anything we're discussing today, but our word for today is Vethar. It literally means a path pulled in stone. It's a vow of constancy, an unchanging commitment to a course once chosen. It is often spoken during formal pledges or rites. It's a symbol of loyalty and persistence. So that is our word for the day. Nope. Not actually gonna work. Why? There. Here we go. Yes. Regularly scheduled homework. Four, emotional tempo differences between characters. One of the strongest lessons from these two chapters is that emotional tempo is not uniform. Jared's responses are often immediate and personal. Greer's are measured and observational. Ethan's are delayed and often strategic. And Callista's are gentle and physically grounding. Each character processes emotion on a different timeline. This presents a flattening of our ensemble. If everyone reacted at the same speed or in the same tone, scenes would feel repetitive, emotional emphasis would blur, and the protagonist's movement would lose contrast. Instead, differing tempos create texture. Readers can feel the tension even in quiet scenes because emotional energy moves through different channels at different speeds. As writers, this can become a diagnostic tool. If your ensemble scenes feel flat, check your emotional timing. Are all your characters reacting at once and in the same way? Ooh. Which characters in your story react first and which one reacts last? What does that reveal about the character themselves? Or the scene? Five, environment as shared emotional infrastructure. Across our broader arc, locations itself often acts as a supporting character. Tanagas, especially the Durza estate, provides emotional steadiness. The hearthrooms, the quiet halls, the balconies, these environments remain consistent while emotional states shift within them. This stability allows support characters to carry subtle shifts without overwhelming the reader. Compare this to scenes set in transient or volatile environments later in the arc. Movement, uncertainty, changing terrain, where support roles may become more explicit or verbal. The key principle here: stable environments allow quieter emotional scaffolding. When settings change rapidly, support characters often need clearer outward behavior to maintain continuity. This is why recovery chapters frequently feel slower, The environment itself holds environmental or emotional weight. Could keeping your characters in a single environment longer allow for emotional shifts to become more visible? Six, the boundary between support and control. A subtle but critical comparison across the arc is this: good scaffolding characters protect agency. In chapters 14 and 15, Ethan advises but does not command. Callista cares without overriding Marin's choice, and Jared offers support without demanding vulnerability. And Greer guards without confining Marin to a specific space. These distinctions prevent support from turning into emotional control. Readers will subconsciously notice this. If our support characters decide everything for the protagonist, emotional investment drops because agency disappears. The infrastructure works precisely because it is optional. It exists to catch, not to direct. Are your supporting characters helping your protagonist move, or are they unintentionally moving them instead? Seven, group dynamics as emotional systems. Let's look at a final comparison here. Group scenes. In earlier phases of the arc, conversations often involve more direct explanation or instruction. By chapters 14 and 15, the group moves fluidly. There are fewer verbal directives, more silent understanding, and emotional roles are clearly established. Ooh, interesting. Yeah, actually, that's actually fascinating. Ooh. I bet that was an interesting conversation. Actually, that type of thing is why I'm kind of doing these analyses of the chapters, because I really want to explore the themes in the story and kind of see what we can pull out of it. So I'm sort of doing something similar. This progression shows accumulated trust. Group dynamics by themselves become a storytelling signal. The readers can perceive growth not through statements, but through how quickly the characters understand each other without speaking. This is powerful ensemble writing. The system becomes visible through efficiency. Ooh, I have not. I have not actually looked at that. Hey, Sin, welcome in. Good to see you. Yeah, it's a little delayed. Frosty Tools is in rare form again. I'm sorry, Sid. Only because I was actually paying attention to chat. If your protagonist stepped out of the room for a moment, would your supporting cast still feel like a living emotional system? Think about that. Yeah, maybe. Part 4, Applied Craft. Up until now, we've been watching how chapters 14 and 15 quietly distribute emotional weight among Ethan, Jared, Greer, and Callista. Now, we shift into the practical question many writers eventually ask. How do I build support characters intentionally so they strengthen the emotional system instead of competing with it? Ooh. That would actually be really interesting. I've tried really hard to make the characters dynamic, and it can be challenging. But definitely would love to get into a more detailed discussion with you about that. So here's our question again. How do I build support characters with intention so that they strengthen the emotional system instead of competing with it? This is where deliberate craft begins. Support characters often emerge naturally during writing. They can feel alive, they demand your attention, and sometimes they become the characters writers secretly enjoy spending the most time with. That's not a problem. The challenge is alignment. A strong support character doesn't become smaller, they become structurally purposeful. Let's walk through how to do that. 1. Define emotional roles, not just narrative roles. Many writers define supporting characters by their function, such as mentor, partner, healer, or commander, or friend. But emotional infrastructure requires a deeper question. What emotional burden does this character carry so that the protagonist doesn't have to carry all of it alone? In chapters 14 and 15, Ethan carries uncertainty and strategic foresight. Jared carries immediate emotional grounding. Greer carries vigilance and safety structure, and Callista carries permission for vulnerability and recovery. Notice that none of these roles overlap completely. This separation prevents emotional noise. And here's a practical technique. Create a simple line in your notes for each support character. This character absorbs blink when tension rises. If two characters absorb the same emotional burden in the same way, consider differentiating them. Not by changing their personality, but by changing their emotional lane. If you had to describe each support character in your story by their emotional weight that they carry, what would those roles be? Two, scaffolding versus spotlight stealing. The key diagnostic. One of the most common ensemble problems appears during editing. A support character starts solving emotional problems for the protagonist. This usually happens because the support character is compelling, and the writer trusts them. But when this happens repeatedly, the protagonist's arc weakens. Here's a useful distinction for you. Scaffolding looks like offering stability, creating opportunities for growth, and holding space. Spotlight stealing often looks like this: explaining the protagonist's feelings, resolving emotional tension too quickly, or becoming the most emotionally dynamic figure in every scene. In chapter 15, for example, Callista's healing scene works because she doesn't declare Marin healed. She reinforces that progress exists but remains unfinished. This keeps emotional ownership with Marin. Ask yourself after each major ensemble scene who changes emotionally, who supports the change, and who initiates it. If the same support character consistently initiates emotional resolution, you might need to rebalance your scene. Is there a character in your draft or your chapter who might be carrying more emotional resolution than intended? I'm going to pause right there because we have an ad starting. I will be right back, my friends. Welcome back, my friends. Thanks for hanging out through that break. I do hope you took the opportunity to actually go get a drink or a snack. That's what they're for. Or, you know, stretch. It's important too. Shoulder's like not happy. Okay. 3. Behavioral support versus verbal support. One of the strongest lessons from these two chapters is how little overt dialogue is actually required. Jared's support often appears as proximity, waiting, or quiet touch. Greer's support appears as watchfulness and control of the space around them. Behavioral support is powerful because it avoids exposition. It respects readers' intelligence, and it keeps scenes emotionally open rather than closing them. During revision, try highlighting all lines where support characters verbally reassure the protagonist. Then ask yourself, could this be shown through behavior instead? Here are some examples. A hand paused nearby but not touching, a chair moved closer, or a watchful presence at the edge of the room. Reducing verbal reassurance often increases emotional credibility. Oh, homework. Yeah, I feel that. Could one piece of dialogue in your current work be replaced by a quieter action that doesn't require dialogue? 4. Building multi-character emotional systems. Ensemble balancing becomes easier when you think in systems instead of pairs. Instead of writing protagonist plus helper, think like this: protagonist and ecosystem. In chapters 14 and 15, scenes rarely rely on a single support character. Different characters overlap without competing with each other. Ethan often handles strategic framing. Jared grounds Marin emotionally. Greer secures the perimeter. And Callista manages physical healing. Because the roles differ, the scene feels layered rather than crowded. Try mapping a scene like this. You have a character, an emotional function, and a visible behavior. Character A might stabilize as their emotional function. Their visible behavior might be watching quietly. Character B has an emotional function of grounding. This might manifest as them staying close to our protagonist. And character C will redirect the tension. What they might do visibly is reframe the discussion. If multiple characters perform identical behaviors, change it up a little bit. Readers experience this change as depth in the scene. Does your ensemble feel like several individuals or one emotional voice split across many people? Think about that. 5. Managing emotional tempo. Support characters can help regulate pacing. Fast emotional responders increase the intensity of a scene. Slow responses tend to stabilize it. In these two chapters, Jared responds quickly, but also personally. Greer often delays his response, and he processes quietly. Ethan often waits before he speaks, and Callista slows scenes physically through touch and care. This variation creates rhythm. If every support character reacts instantly, scenes can feel rushed. If everyone waits, scenes can stagnate. During editing, try to identify the following things: who reacts first, who reacts last, and why. Assign intentional tempo differences. This can create natural emotional layering without adding extra dialogue. Who in your story or a particular scene slows the emotional pacing, and who accelerates it? Number 6. Reader trust and unfinished edges. One reason that chapters 14 and 15 feel emotionally believable is that they refuse to have tidy closure. Support characters don't instantly fix Marin. They make continued motion possible. This preserves reader trust. Readers know But healing isn't linear. Emotional systems evolve, and support doesn't erase pain. As writers, we sometimes fear leaving scenes unresolved. But unresolved edges are where the emotional continuity lives. After completing a scene, ask yourself, what remains unfinished in this scene? And what emotional thread is carried forward from this scene? If everything resolves neatly, consider pulling back. Let the support characters stabilize rather than immediately solve. Are you allowing emotional tension to continue breathing between scenes? These are all things that I have really tried to work on, and I am by no means an expert. I am sharing the things that I have learned. So, hopefully it's helpful. Number 7. Adaptation across genres. This technique isn't limited to just recovery narratives. Support as infrastructure appears in many genres. In romance, one character may carry emotional vulnerability while another character carries practical reality. In fantasy, advisors or companions stabilize moral tension around the hero. In a mystery or a thriller, partners may absorb procedural pressure while the protagonist processes the emotional stakes. And in science fiction ensemble stories, crews function as emotional ecosystems under external threat. The core principle stays the same, however. Support characters maintain movement without replacing the protagonist's emotional journey. And 8. An editing pass infrastructure check. Here's an optional revision pass that you can try. The infrastructure pass. Read through a chapter and ask yourself, who holds the emotional tension when the protagonist can't? Are the support characters distinct in their functions? Does anyone resolve emotion too quickly? Is support shown through behavior as often as dialogue? And does the protagonist still drive emotional change? These questions often reveal subtle imbalances that are hard to see during drafting. We've now moved from observation into application, looking at how to intentionally design support characters as emotional systems rather than competing arcs. Next, we'll move into our Q&A and guided discussion. As always, this section is low pressure, and you don't have to answer in chat if you don't want to. Before we move on, hold on to this thought for a moment. If you removed one support character from your story, what emotional weight would suddenly become visible? Sometimes that answer tells you exactly what their purpose in the story is. And we're going to shift tone slightly here, not into anything high energy by any means, but into a more conversational rhythm. This portion of our workshop is a question and answer section, but it's designed to remain low pressure. You don't need to speak and chat. You don't need to have any polished questions. Sometimes the most useful participation is quiet, listening, thinking, and letting the ideas settle while you work on your own writing. Think of it more as a guided reflection rather than actually asking questions. I'll offer some gentle prompts that often come up when writers begin exploring support characters as emotional infrastructure. You can treat them as questions or simply as things to sit beside for a while. Prompt 1. How do I know if a support character is taking too much focus? This question appears often, especially in long-form writing where support characters become deeply loved. A helpful indicator is emotional resolution. Ask yourself these things. Who experiences the emotional shift at the end of the scene? Who learns something emotionally new? And who changes direction? If the answer is consistently a supporting character to any of these questions, rather than the protagonist, you may be drifting towards spotlight imbalance. In chapters 14 and 15, Ethan, Jared, Greer, and Callista each have emotional presence, but Marin remains the emotional point of change. Their actions create safety, structure, and grounding, yet the reader's internal focus stays anchored to Marin's responses. Here's a practical check for you. Read a scene and imagine removing the protagonist's internal perspective. If the emotional impact remains unchanged, the scaffolding may be carrying too much narrative weight. This doesn't mean reducing your support characters, only realigning the emotional gravity. Do your support characters amplify your protagonist's emotional movement, or do they compete with it? Prompt 2. What if my support characters feel more interesting than my protagonist? I have to admit that some of my support characters are very, very interesting, and I'm actually thinking about doing origin stories for some of them. I'm not gonna lie. Okay. Marin is the OG, of course, but some of the other characters, Greer, Ethan, they don't have their own origin stories. Callista does, but Ethan and Greer don't, and I've definitely been thinking about doing origin stories for them for that reason. So you might stumble upon that for yourself as well. This is more common than many writers really want to admit. Support characters often appear confident because they are not carrying the main arc's uncertainty. In these chapters, for example, Greer's steadiness feels strong precisely because he isn't the one recovering, and Ethan appears grounded because he holds strategy rather than the vulnerability that Marin is carrying. The solution is not to diminish your supporting characters. Instead, ask yourself, what emotional risk is the protagonist carrying that others are allowing them to carry? The protagonist's vulnerability, the willingness to change, is the true center. Support characters can look stable because someone else is doing the difficult emotional work. Sometimes noticing this can help reframe everything. What emotional risk does your protagonist take that no one else in the ensemble can take for them? I don't know. That's a good question, actually. Prompt 3. How many support characters is too many? Well, to be honest, there isn't a fixed number. What matters most is the clarity of their emotional role. In chapter 15, for instance, several characters share the scene, but each has a distinct function: healing, grounding, vigilance, and strategic concern. Because these roles are distinct, the scene remains readable. Confusion happens when multiple characters do the same emotional work. Here's a gentle guideline. If two characters respond emotionally in the same way, readers may mentally merge them, or it will begin to feel crowded. Differentiation does not require dramatic personality shifts. Sometimes it's simply the pacing of the scene. One character might speak immediately while another waits, and yet another communicates only through movement. That alone can create some clarity in the scene. Could you describe each support character's emotional role in one quiet sentence? I probably could. Prompt 4. How do I keep group scenes calm and readable? Group scenes can often become overwhelming because every character responds loudly and at the same time. Chapters 14 and 15 demonstrates another approach. Characters take turn holding the tension. Sometimes one speaks while others observe. Sometimes silence merely fills the space. The scene breathes because not every character reacts simultaneously. This is especially important in emotionally heavy stories, which mine are. Readers need space to orient themselves. Here's a useful technique. Before writing a group scene, decide who carries the emotional center of the scene, who's observing, and who supports through action rather than speech. Think of it as emotional choreography, if you will. In your group scenes, who tends to speak first? What would happen if that changed? And prompt 5. How do I write quiet support without it feeling passive? Quiet doesn't mean inactive. Greer standing watch at a doorway is still active. Jared standing beside Marin's bed through the night is definitely active. He is intention. Readers feel activity when behavior clearly serves an emotional purpose. Small actions carry weight when they connect to established roles. A nod acknowledging progress, a presence maintained through difficult silence, and a routine continued because someone must hold the line. Quiet support works when readers understand the stakes behind the stillness. What small intentional behavior in your story could carry a more emotional weight than a big dramatic speech? Definitely something to think about. I spend a lot of time in my stories focusing on subtle actions and a lot of time where characters don't necessarily say a lot. And prompt number 6. The quiet question that many writers hold on to. Sometimes writers ask, though not always allowed, whether support characters are allowed to have their own emotional lives. The answer to that question? Most definitely yes. But those emotions should intersect with the protagonist's journey rather than eclipse it. In these chapters, we glimpse concern, fatigue, and history in Ethan and Greer. We feel Jared's exhaustion. We sense Callista's steel beneath her gentleness. These details deepen realism without redirecting the focus. Think of support character emotions as texture, not necessarily a destination. Do your support characters feel alive beyond the page, even when the story isn't following them directly? Right. We'll begin winding down from here. The purpose of this next section isn't to provide definitive answers, it's to create a space where questions can sit gently beside your work. Questions you might return to during editing or when a scene feels slightly off but you can't yet name why. Support characters as emotional infrastructure is a long-form skill. It strengthens over time as relationships accumulate shared history. And often, you won't recognize you've done it well until readers tell you they feel safe inside a scene without knowing exactly why. As we prepare to move into our closing, consider this. Who in your story quietly holds the line so your protagonist can keep moving? The quiet architecture of story. As we begin to close tonight's workshop, I want to linger for a moment on something that can be easy to miss when we're deep inside drafting or editing. Readers often remember the protagonist most clearly, but what allows those protagonists to feel believable, to feel human, is the architecture built around them. Support characters are not merely decoration. They are not simply dialogue partners or exposition characters. When written thoughtfully, they become emotional infrastructure. They can create room to breathe, places where tension can rest without disappearing, and systems that hold weight when the central character can't carry everything alone. In chapters 14 and 15, we see this clearly. Ethan carries structure and strategy. Jared carries closeness and steady grounding. Greer carries vigilance and reliability. I'm sorry. Trying to do something. And Callista carries healing and permission to pause. None of them steals the emotional spotlight. Together, they make emotional survival plausible. And perhaps that is the deeper lesson tonight. A protagonist's resilience rarely exists in isolation. Stories breathe more naturally when emotional responsibility is shared. As writers, we sometimes focus so intensely on a single arc that we forget to ask ourselves, who keeps the story emotionally stable while change is happening? Support characters answer that question. They create continuity across chapters by staying present. Wait, 1 second. Okay, sorry, I'm switching songs. They create continuity across chapters by staying present through repeated behaviors, quiet routines, and consistent care. A hand that hovers but doesn't force, a nod that acknowledges effort, and a watch kept through the night. These moments rarely announce themselves as important, but they still accumulate. Readers feel them as safety, and safety is what allows vulnerability on the page to feel earned rather than manufactured. If you're currently working on scenes that feel fragile, scenes where your characters are struggling, healing, or simply trying to keep moving, it's okay if progress looks small. Emotional infrastructure is built slowly. Sometimes it's created in revision when you realize a support character only needs one quiet action to transform the entire emotional tone of a scene. Sometimes it's created by removing dialogue rather than adding it. And sometimes it's simply allowing characters to stay present without solving anything. Why it works still changes the story. Here's some homework for you. As always, this is optional. Take only what feels useful to what you're currently working on. 1. Emotional lane mapping. This should take about 10 or 15 minutes. Choose one scene from your current story. List your support characters and write one sentence for each. What emotional weight are they carrying so the protagonist doesn't have to? Don't overthink. Your first instinct is usually enough. 2. The silence pass. This is a revision exercise. Find one moment where a support character gives reassurance through dialogue. Ask yourself, would this become a behavior instead? Try rewriting it and see what happens. 3. An ensemble balance check. After reading a scene, ask yourself, who changes emotionally here? Who stabilizes the scene? Does the protagonist remain emotionally central? If the answer feels unclear, find a useful revision point. Again, these are invitations, not assignments. They're for you to stretch your mental muscles as a writer if you so choose. Before we end tonight, take a moment, whether you're writing actively right now or simply listening, and consider the people who stand quietly around your own stories. The characters who don't need dramatic moments to matter. The ones who hold the line. The ones whose steadiness allows transformation to happen safely. Those characters are often where emotional truth lives quietly. And as long-form storytellers, learning to see them clearly can change the way we build entire narratives. Thank you, everyone, for spending time in the archives with me tonight. I hope you were able to continue your work, and I hope that you enjoyed this time in the archives this evening. Normally I would raid out, but I'm not going to do that tonight. I will let you know that Wednesday will be a little bit of a special stream. It's actually my 2-year affiliate anniversary. I will also be doing a special stream on Friday, March 20th as a fundraiser for Starlight. So would love to see you for both streams. I hope you guys have an awesome rest of your evening and a good start to your week. Take care. Have a good night, everybody.